Hi, my name is Lila and I'm the Mini Witch. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This week's video is beginner to advanced painting techniques to paint more consistently, faster, and better. I'm starting with the most basic of techniques and then slowly moving on to more advanced techniques. Now, you might disagree and think that one technique is more difficult than the other, but it really all depends on the individual. So if you're watching this, I highly recommend going at least one level past whatever you feel comfortable doing. You never know what's going to be easier for you, and you're not going to be able to get better and use more advanced techniques unless you try them out. Thinning down your paint. Thinning down your paint is the act of using water or a thinning agent to change the consistency of your paint. Why would you want to thin your paint? There are two types of consistencies you need to be aware of when mini painting. The first is related to the consistency of the brand of paint you're using, and the second consistency is related to the technique you want to use while painting. In general, paint that is thicker is more difficult to work with. While these thicker paints might be more opaque, they're going to be more difficult to use when you're trying to do more nuanced and detailed techniques like what we'll talk about later in this video. Thicker paint can also obscure details and add texture to your miniature. So now that we know why, let's go on to how. I swear Mochi is finding the noisiest toys that he can. Don't make me get up, Mochi. I have my new fancy lavalier here, which is hopefully going to make my sound so much better, but does limit the ability I have to stop my cats from playing with really obnoxious toys unless they bat it right here. Thank you, Mochi. Anyway, so now that we know why you want to thin your paint, let's go on to how. First, shake your paint and then load it onto your wet palette. Paint consistency can change quite a bit based on agitation, so shake ferociously. Once the paint is on your palette, examine the consistency of your paint. Like I said before, Citadel and Scale Color tends to be a lot thicker than, say, Reaper paint. To thin down your paint, you will either use water or a glaze or thinner mixture. For the most part, either one works fine, but when I'm creating glaze mixtures or doing wet blending, I do tend to prefer to use the Vallejo glaze medium, as I think that it disperses the pigments more evenly, therefore allowing me smoother blends. The amount of liquid you want to add to your paint will depend on, like I said before, your paint brand and what you want to use the paint for. Basing, layering, and glazing will all have different consistencies. For now, slowly start adding water to your paints and testing the consistencies on the back of your hand so you can get a general feeling of how water and paint interact together and the opacity that you can achieve with different ratios of paint and water. Loading your brush. Loading your brush means to load your brush with either liquid or paint. Without getting too sciencey, the more liquid that is in the belly of your brush, the easier the paint is going to flow off of the bristles and onto your miniature. There are a few ways that you can load your brush. First, you can dip your paintbrush into your water cup, wring it out on the side of your glass, and then dip that into your paint. This way is a little more advanced because depending on the amount of liquid you leave in your brush, you can greatly change the consistency of your paint. Second is to thin down your paint either with water or glaze medium on your wet palette. Then you can load up your brush about halfway with the paint itself. Thirdly, you can do a combination of both, which is how I usually paint. I usually dip my brush in my water cup, wring out the majority of it in my paint cup, apply a quick dab to my paper towel, and then place my damp brush in my paint, loading it up about halfway. Just remember that you're going to need to practice on your hand a lot. It might seem difficult at first, but I promise that the more you do it, the easier it's going to become. If the paint suddenly blobs off your brush in a huge puddle, your brush is too loaded, either with your water or your paint could be too thin and then still your brush is overloaded. Base coat. Your base coat is the first layer of paint that you're going to apply to your model, and it really sets the tone for how the rest of your project is going to go. If you mess up on the base layer, you're kinda screwed. I would rather apply 2 thinner layers of my base color than 1 too thick layer. That could obscure details. And it's just too risky for me to possibly build up unwanted texture. The consistency of a base coat should be as thick as you can get it while still flowing off your brush. You shouldn't see any clumps of paint. You don't want this to look like a road that has been snowplowed with drifts of snowbanks on either side.
If the paint stays in that sort of snowplow texture and doesn't spread out evenly, then it's too thick. However, if it starts out in that consistency but eventually flows flat, it's good enough. Of course, these are just my personal rules of thumb, and your experience may vary.
With Reaper paints, a lot of time, I don't have to thin them down at all for a base coat consistency. However, like I said, scale 75 requires more finesse with water to get it to the right consistency. If you're having difficulty with your color of choice, consider basing with a different color. For example, if you're trying to paint a red cape and you're having a really hard time getting the red to show up on your gray primer, consider basing with brown or white. These colors are usually more opaque and will help create a better base to apply your colors. The second option would be to add white to your base color. The pigments that make up white paint are larger than some of the other colors. So if you're having a hard time getting the opacity that you want, consider mixing your color with white. Once you've achieved a proper base coat opacity on your miniature, you can then go back over that with your base color of choice. Layering. Layering is the action of placing several applications of paint over top of each other. Layering is a great way to blend colors and build highlights and shadows.
Your layer consistency should be the exact same as your base color. The goal for a layer and a base coat are the same. Apply as opaque of a paint as possible. The only difference is that layering is done on specific areas to build up highlights and shadows.
The important thing with layering is creating a smooth gradation of colors. You don't want to use paint that's too thin, otherwise you're just going to need to apply more and more layers till you reach your desired color. To begin, mix all of the colors that you're going to want on your wet palette, all the way from your shadow, your midtones to your highlights. For your base, you can start with whatever color you want, but I usually start with my midtones and then layer up my highlights and shadows. So, to layer your highlights and shadows, you're just going to apply your layer of paint in the shape of your highlight or shadow. And then each consecutive layer of paint after that is going to be brighter and smaller than the one before it. Imagine it like building a pyramid.
We will talk about filling in those steps of the pyramid with glazing later.
Lining. Lining is a technique of placing a dark line in between elements of your miniature. This is twofold. First, it's going to act as shadows in areas that would otherwise be too small to really give interesting depth to, as well as separate different sections from each other. Lining helps your miniature look cleaner overall. I recommend doing lining either with a lining brush or with a detail brush. Using a larger round brush can be a bit more difficult because you do lining at the end and the fat belly of the brush could make it so that you accidentally knock other areas that you've already painted. Paint for lining should have the same consistency as your base or layer paint. For lining, I usually use a color that's darker than whatever area I'm trying to line, or you could use black if you want a lot of contrast or a more cartoonish style. Glazing. Glazing is the act of using thinned down paint to blend your layers together, or slightly alter a color on your miniature. A glaze is created by diluting paint with either water or a glaze medium. Like I said before, I usually prefer using a glaze medium as I feel that it suspends the pigments more evenly.
These glazes are what is going to fill in those steps of the pyramid so they are smooth. Here you can see how I have my base, midtone, and highlight. I'm then creating a glaze to go in between each of these layer steps and applying them over the stripe of my gradation.
Dark colors are far easier to glaze with than light colors. Because lighter colors have larger pigments, those individual pigments are a lot easier to see when you're creating glazes. Instead of glazing areas lighter, I recommend creating an actual paint mixture more aligned to a layer and lightening it that way.
Lastly, you can also create glazes with inks. Since inks are a dye, you don't have to worry about those individual pigments like we did when thinning down white paint. Inks can be used to intensify color and then add color contrast without needing to repaint over old areas.
Feathering. Feathering is blending out the edges of your layer consistency paint with a damp brush. Feathering can be done in place of glazing on your layer consistency paint. What you're going to do is apply your paint like you normally would, and then quickly use a damp brush and blend out or feather out those edges.
Use the belly of your brush and a back and forth motion for the smoothest gradation.
What I usually do is dip my paintbrush in water, put it in my mouth to regain that perfect point and get the perfect amount of liquid, and then feather out my edges. Make sure your brush isn't too wet, otherwise the liquid from your brush can blob up and dilute those areas and really mess things up for you. Wet blending. Wet blending is a technique that I use all the time on miniature painting because wet blending makes blending paints a lot faster. Wet blending is best done on small to medium areas and with similar colors. So I usually wet blend areas like the capes on a 28mm model or maybe the thigh of a 72mm model. However, if I was going to do like the cape of a... Why are you biting me? Why are you lying on me, cuddling and biting me at the same time? So for example, on my 6-inch model that I used for the big boss fight for my D&D campaign, the cape on that would not be a good place to wet blend. To begin, you'll apply your first color, pulling it further down than you actually want that gradation to go. Then quickly clean your brush and then apply your second color. Then using a back and forth motion, you're going to blend your second color up into your first color.
This time you'll want to pull your color to the approximate location you want your transition to occur. Finally, you'll clean your brush, remove the majority of the water, and once again use a back and forth motion to blend the colors together. Again, be sure to use the belly of your brush to help make the transition smooth.
If you can see paint strokes, or if your paint was too thin, you can either do a second round of wet blending or you can perfect that wet blending with glazing. It is also important to consider what colors you're going to be wet blending together. For example, yellow and purple would be pretty much a nightmare to attempt to wet blend, whereas trying to wet blend red to yellow would be very easy. Look at your colors and their proximity to each other on the color wheel and use that as your guide. Finally is the loaded brush technique. The loaded brush technique is one that I'm by no means a master at. I'm not even sure if I'm good at it. I would say I am proficient at the loaded brush technique. The loaded brush technique is actually blending two colors of paint in your brush while you're painting. To do the loaded brush technique, you're first going to begin by loading your brush with your second color of your gradation. Then you're going to dip the tip into your second color, and that's going to be the first color of your gradation.
Since I'm not very good at the loaded brush technique, I have a tendency to accidentally load the front half of my brush with too much paint, so when I do that, I just dab some of it off on a paper towel.
Then begin filling in those areas with a back and forth motion, and as you go, you're going to blend those two colors together.
And again, you'll want to use the belly of your brush to help blend out that transition.
If you decide that this is a technique that you want to look into, go ahead and look at Ben Comet's. He is the master. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that it was useful and helpful to you. Let me know in the comments down below. What technique are you most excited to try out that you think is going to help push your miniature painting to the next level? If you like what I do here, you know the drill. Subscribe, ring the bell so that you can get notifications when I upload. Follow me on Instagram, and most importantly, you can support me on Patreon, where you can join my growing Discord server, get feedback from myself and other miniature painters in my community. I recently just added a 3D printing channel because so many people are interested in 3D printing that I went ahead and made an area specifically for that, because this is a community that's all about you guys, and I want to make sure that I'm providing the resources that I can to help you get better. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.
Can we talk about how utterly adorable and sweet and calm this little shitten is as soon as I'm not filming and I'm not sitting in his chair?